Welcome, anyone watching. This is Unscripted with Tory and Kevin. I'm excited to be here with Kevin today. Today, we're going to talk about books we've read recently. And we're going to talk both about how we read those books for anyone who doesn't have a regular reading habit and wants one, as well as some specific books in case you're looking for recommendations. So that's what I'm excited to talk with you about today. Kevin, anything to add there?
No, just saying, I think that part of the reason you and I have connected the way we have is because of the shared love of reading and ideas and riffing back and forth. So I think this would be interesting for us to do today.
Nice. Well, and so let's start off talking about, our sort of reading method and why we read. If you had to tell someone, Kevin, why you read books, right? Seemingly simple question. Why do you read?
I'm gonna tell it in a story form, I guess, just to like what was the spark. I had an executive coach at Atlassian, same as Shirley. So shout out to Shirley. I'd always read, but lightly. It was kind of here and there. I, just had a pattern of reading, and then I had kids, and that kind of interrupted the intensity of reading. And it was about 5 years ago, and as part of my first homework on our first session together, he gave me a list of 3 books that I needed to go read. And as I read them, I was enthralled. I think it was the kind of the right time in my career where my team had been growing and scaling, and we were having issues, and I'm trying to solve my way through them. And in these books, I was seeing a pattern and a pathway, I guess, to find a solution to the problems I was facing. And so that was this like amazement. And it sounds silly to be like, oh, someone has gone through the problem I've gone through before and has some guidance for how to get through it. And that will save me and my team a lot of headache and heartache. And so the why I read was related to that, just going on that journey of the awareness that people have distilled their life learning into a book. And, very inexpensively in both time and money, I can gather that same insight without having to have gone through the firsthand pain myself. So that was a long story, but that is the why behind my reading.
Yeah, well, and I hear you recognizing that books are a way to learn cheaply and efficiently,
Mhm. Very much
right?
so.
Think about the learning we get through a course or even through coaching. It's definitely slower. We can sit down and read a book and we can get the insight quite quickly. We can get it in one sitting,
Yes.
right? And so that opportunity to learn efficiently and cost efficiently, books also cost less than those other things I
Yes.
mentioned. It's a great mechanism.
Very much.
It's funny, my why is very similar. I think I read to learn, and then I read almost just to like massage my brain, right? It's like
Mhm.
going to the gym for my brain.
Mhm.
These things where you have to stay active in order to keep things healthy. I think my brain is engaged as I work, but it's engaged in a different way when I read. And reading is different from viewing content, right? If we think of reading as a content consumption format, if
Right.
I'm watching something, even something informative, the way I consume it, the sort of light bulbs that I get from it is just very different from reading. And
Yes.
so by carving out that time, making it enjoyable, learning things, and keeping my brain going, I like to think that I'm basically keeping my brain healthier by continuing to
I
read.
think it's very true. There's a couple of people, Cal Newport, I think, is one that talks about the skill of focus and, how that's something you can cultivate through reading, this kind of dedicated activity. And then, I don't know about you, but I've read several books on how to read a book. And they do talk about the skill of, there are several books that are beyond you. And that's a good thing. It's just like a weight that's too heavy or something that you can't do yet. And you don't gain the skill of reading the hard book by waiting. You gain the skill by reading harder books and challenging your brain to adapt to learning vocabulary and figuring out through usage and tying it into your semantic memory to tie to other books and bring more of yourself to bear on a book. And so I think it's 100% true that reading is a skill, and it's working out your brain, and it's going to keep it fresh up into both our old age.
Well, and it's a great point about reading being a skill, one that comes through practice. And there's actually a lot more complexity than we give it credit, right? We think, okay, I learned how to read in school, so I know how to read now as an adult. Often not, right? Both
Yep.
the making time for the activity of reading and actually doing the reading in a way that you're going to get something back from it. Both of
Yep.
those probably take a little bit of practice. And so if anyone hasn't been reading and is feeling guilty or bad about it, look, take that beginner's mind, allow yourself to practice it because, yeah, it's actually a more complex habit than you might think. And that doesn't mean you can't incorporate it in your day.
Yeah, 100%. Reminds me of Naval Ravikant quote around something like, read what you love until you love reading, something like that. That in the beginning, don't worry about what you think you should be reading. Read something that brings you joy and happiness and whatever other positive feelings, because it's like building any habit. You've got to want and enjoy the habit, and you've got to start wherever you are. And so, yeah, reading what you love and then eventually growing your capacity to take on more challenging things.
It's so funny. I was just remembering where I don't think the insight dawned on me until after college that I could read things that weren't like the official, special
Yeah.
literature. I
Yeah.
remember I'd always think of reading of like, you've got to read something from this canon. And
Yeah.
so I wouldn't really pick up stuff to read for fun. But then I found some nonsense book like The Devil Wears Prada or something like
Yeah.
that, right? That's just like really, and I was like, oh, I can just read also to relax my brain, right? Like doesn't have to be a learning book. You may be learning things through fiction, but reading can be easy. Doesn't have to be from this should read list.
Yes, 100%. That is Dan Brown for me. I forget the names of those
Oh,
books, but Da Vinci Code.
yeah,
But
yeah.
those are not challenging books, but certainly an enjoyable book.
Yeah. Well, because something I've been realizing is I can't read thoughtful books before bed because then my
How about
brain
that?
will get going. But I can read fiction before bed because I almost have a looser, right? It's not activating my thinking as much. And so it's funny to say, like, okay, is this type of book actually going to make me think? And if not, it also has value, but it almost goes in a different category.
Maybe that's a good segue into our habits because I read almost exclusively at night before bed. And so I'm always reading nonfiction, challenging thinking books. I will say that there are times when like it actually happened in the last week because I was working with a client of mine and I was like, oh, this gives me an idea. And then I'm in bed with a Kindle and I'm like, how do I get this idea? But that's kind of rare. And I put my note in Kindle, but yeah, there's definitely something there about why reading at other times is beneficial. But do you want to jump into a little bit of our practice on reading?
Yeah, of how we read, and I'll just comment on that one quickly, the point you made. I find so often when I'm reading nonfiction, sometimes the same happens when I'm listening to a podcast, I get a thought or an insight that then I have to go develop. So I will
Mhm.
basically finish reading because some thought has occurred to me that I have to go write down. And
Yeah.
so often it's sparking some new understanding or some new idea that I can't do that at 9 p.m. I don't want to be hopping on my computer,
Yes.
and thinking. And
Yeah.
so I read the time that I read is in the middle of the day because I've observed that if I'm sitting at the computer all day, it makes my neck and shoulders
Yeah.
sore. So when I hit that point of starting to feel not so good, take a break, go read for an hour, usually until I get one of those insights, and then I'm
Yeah.
back on the computer. But it serves as a good break of activities during the day, recognizing I think that we're not at our most productive if we just chain ourselves to a computer for hours. So if I have time between client sessions, if I have time between writing things, I make these breaks for reading.
Yeah, and the point of getting an insight, I just want to highlight how powerful that is and how that comes from books. And if you're cruising along in your career, your business, or whatever, and you're really not getting that from your peer group. You're kind of going through the motions at work. You're kind of stuck in day-to-day operations. Well, you're never improving because you're just day over day doing the same thing. But if you're reading and you're being challenged and you're thinking and you're observing, all of a sudden you kind of inflect that trajectory of growth and you start to go somewhere interesting and why books are a really powerful force for action, not just for academic insight. It's not like I don't think either of us read to go aha, although that's kind of cool. It's the aha of application. It's like aha, this wants to take me somewhere and I want to do something different. And so being able to take the written word into behavioral change or action is I think a really powerful thing that you don't always get from kind of going through your day to day. It's really a powerful thing from books.
It's so interesting though, because I can almost hear the pushback of someone watching or listening
Mm.
this saying, I don't have time. I don't
Yeah.
have time to read. I'm too busy. I'm pulled in too many directions. And what I would say to that person is, look, the thing I always said to folks when I was in corporate is you've got to take time for lunch, right? Take 30 minutes to eat. I don't care what else is happening. Like just go be a human for 30 minutes. That
Yeah.
could be a time to read, right? Reading is or lunch is sometimes a great social time. You hang out with your team, talking not about work. But if you prefer some solo recharge time in the middle of the day, say because you're more introverted and you've been in meetings all day,
Yeah.
gosh, a half hour lunch with a book could be such a treat. And so seeing if you can covariate with another thing you have to do, right? You got to eat. You might be forgetting to eat if you're working really hard, but don't forget to eat. Putting reading with that might help it, find time in a busy day.
Yeah, it made me think of a quote. I won't be able to bring it to bear, but it's something like Ram Charan is the name of the guy, I'm pretty sure. And he talks about how a half hour a day reading habit will do more for your career development than just about anything else that you could attempt. And, there's the Atomic Habits book, if anyone wants to learn how to develop a habit. But, I've advised people in the past to just start with one, something you enjoy. So it could be a comic book, it could be a fiction book, a beach read, literally just anything to get practice at holding something in your hand and having a page. And start with a page. Like a page takes 1 to 2 minutes. And if you just, for me, I suggest finding a trigger. Mine is bedtime. So when you lay in bed, pick up a book, read one page, set it down. You started the journey. And pretty much anyone can sustain a 1 page a day habit. And so start small, start fun, and then build from there.
That's a great one, and I can see how it's calling from Atomic Habits. That's actually one of the books I've read recently,
Oh, really?
so
That's a
we
great
talk
book.
about
That's one of my
that.
best. Yeah.
So before we dive on in specific books, we've talked a little bit about when we carve out reading in our day. But if you had to characterize how you read, Kevin, how do you read?
Okay, how do I read? I read very intentionally. I mentioned I'm doing it because I'm trying to solve problems. And so as I encounter problems or get recommendations on things I think would solve a problem, those books then get loaded into a backlog. I use Amazon wish list is just my easiest way to do it. I know other people who can use Goodreads, but really it's just a backlog, and it's free and easy for something to go into that backlog. And I probably have about 500 books on my backlog in different lists. From there, after I finish a book or, I'm looking for a solution to a problem I'm experiencing, I will look at what I've already purchased or I'll look in that backlog. So if I'm wanting to get better at sales, I'll look at all the books on sales or marketing, or, maybe there's a behavioral challenge or there's something about who knows. I'll go grab that. If there's not an acute problem, that's okay. That happens too. And so I'll look for, anything that drives interest. Those get purchased and put onto my Kindle, which is how I read predominantly. And I'll do that for a reason I'll share in a moment about my method for remembering what I learned. But I get it on my Kindle. Right now, my Kindle has about 116 books that I've already purchased and not yet read. And so that's my list of things to scan through. And so when I finish a book, I do kind of look and what draws my attention. Is there a problem to solve, or is there something that pulls me into a particular book? Knowing that sometimes it's not the right time. I don't do it alphabetically. I don't do it, chronographic. I can't think of the word right now. I don't do it that way. I do it really by feel and interest. And so I scan just for that reason that this is a habit I want to continue to enjoy and not feel like labor. And then when I start reading, my method is to take notes while I read, which on Kindle just means highlighting. And then more often than not, I do put a note because I've read my highlights later and wondered why past Kevin highlighted that. Like there's some insight that I had at the time that was like, oh, this is profound. But I didn't tell myself, future Kevin, why it was profound, and I'm just lost. So now more often than not, I'll put some sort of note just to be, what did this connect to? Why did I think this? And then I use an external service called Readwise. And I do that because it essentially sucks up all of those highlights into a personal database for me. And that now becomes a repository that I can interact with. And every day I read 10 of those. And then I tag them. I elaborate on my own notes or add notes if they're missing. And so I'm constantly like going through my past learnings to keep them kind of fresh and, wire those synapses. And then I also bring them into a tool called Obsidian. It auto syncs in there, and I put those quotes onto concept pages. So now I'm taking an idea and then I'm finding any content from across all of the books I've read that elaborate on that idea. This is part of what goes into my newsletter because I write on those ideas, but that's just my process to so having a pain point, building a backlog, following, kind of my passion and interest, taking notes, tagging them, building a concept page. So it's a way to constantly chew on the reading as opposed to just reading and putting it on a bookshelf and hoping I remember it. So I'll pause there, but that's really the meat of my process.
Well, what I really admire about your approach is how intentionally you distill the insights from the reading, right? You take those aha moments while you're reading it, but then by going back after reading and going back again, right, and collating those concept pages, you really give an opportunity for the information to sink in on areas that you've identified are important that you want to learn about.
Yep. And it also helps when I read, because I read a lot of nonfiction. And that includes, well, I'll just do quote business books. But I also like history. And I think there's a lot of lessons from history that connect to concept pages. And we'll talk later about one of the World War I history books that I read recently. But because the business books are talking about these concepts about how to run a business, which on our leadership podcast, we talked about leadership being kind of mastering co-creation amongst people. That happens in history as well, either through military or otherwise. And you can see the cross, application of those ideas. And I'm more attuned to them when reading the kind of historical nonfiction because of reading the business books. And it just brings those out of the page much more so than they would if I didn't go through this process for me, like for me.
Well, I'm hearing the connections you may be making between the two, right? Written for sort of very different genres, but
Yep.
you have these cross-combining insights that you're able to draw because you're reading in those different categories.
Yep. Yep. And
There's
how
so
about you? What about your process?
well, and I was just going to say, there's a book there for you to write about things that you see
Okay.
in history and in business books and sort of
Yeah.
interesting overlaps there. So just saying.
Fire that away.
So my approach to reading is so different, and I think that's awesome, right? Because it shows folks that you can be really flexible in how you apply this with what
Yeah.
works for you. I don't have a backlog. I am much more impulsive. That's the word, impulsive in how I get books on my list. So I will hear about a book from someone. I'll go download it on my Kindle on Amazon. Then Amazon almost always suggests related books after that. Almost always at least one of the covers or titles looks interesting, piques my interest. So I download that one. Then Amazon does it again. Then Amazon does it again. I have these like a download sessions where I will download 20 books at once, right? I looked at the past month, I downloaded 80 samples
Mhm.
from Kindle because they're free. There's no loss to trying something and having it be a total dud, which,
Yep.
as I'll share in a moment with the number, many of them are duds. But I guess I'm subject to Amazon marketing,
Yep.
where I just go find an interesting book or topic and then find a number of things that segue from that. Often there are other books on a related topic. And so it gives me an interesting corpus of things that show up in my samples when I then go to my Kindle. When I go to my Kindle, I then choose which samples call my interest on any given day. And say I have 80 books, actually, these are the numbers. I have 83 samples I've downloaded since the past month. 15 I haven't opened. 45 I scanned but didn't even finish the sample. 23 I finished the sample and wrote a summary. And then I've only downloaded 4 full books. So the vast majority, I'm just reading to see if there's something interesting there. If there isn't, I stop. As soon as it's not interesting, I feel like I don't vibe with their message or their approach or their writing style, I will stop. Even if it's only a page or two in, I'll just stop. Sometimes also with the sample, I don't need to download the rest of the book because I've gotten the thesis. They basically communicated their thesis well enough in the sample that I feel like I understand it, I can take the insight from it. I don't need any more evidence, and so I can pick that up very quickly. And so I do think that allows me to only read and purchase books that I'm really interested by, right? That I have read the sample and said, yes, I want to read more. And it allows me to sort of dynamically in the moment, okay, pick which of these is most interesting with that list I've got on my Kindle. But yeah, I think I'm pretty pruny, right? That I will just give up on something if I don't like it. And then I don't actually do the same as you in terms of the intentional structure afterwards. But what I find is in these hours where I go read, almost always they end because I have an insight I want to go write about. So something occurs to me from a book, an idea I want to explore further or figure out a way to apply. So I will jump down here to my computer, open up a doc, and then write about how I might apply that insight in my day to day. And so it's a way to take these sort of books and create immediate action. And that's almost always what ends my reading, if not ended by lunch or something else, right? But it's fairly frequent that I'll get an insight worth writing about.
That's great. And one of the things I like about your process is not every book needs to be a book. We know that, and you're kind of embodying that where the sample may give you the kernel of an idea, and that's sufficient. And you don't need to buy the book or spend the time reading the book because you got what you needed. And so I really respect that about your process. It reminded me of something I've learned about my own reading is that I don't love allegory or story as much as I like just kind of straight principle. And so recently, one of the books I finished, at the end of every chapter, the author would go through this manufactured dialogue with a hypothetical person to like watch the other person learn the principles that they just wrote. And I read the first one because, I'm first time reader of this book and trying to see what's there, realized it doesn't matter to me. So then in every subsequent chapter, when they got to that period, I would just, quickly go to the end of the chapter. So I skip like pieces of books because I'm trying to do the same thing you are. Like, what is the ROI on my time? And I don't need to read every page. That's been a long lesson learned. I wasn't always that way, kind of very dutiful, I've got to read every word, or if I don't, it doesn't count as having read the book. So I'm just going to plow through these awful sections, but I've gotten more relaxed in my old age.
Two things come to mind when you talk about that. One, I remember how I read Game of Thrones, at least when Game of Thrones was still coming out with books, right? It hasn't a number of years. There are just entire characters, chapters who I would skip. I was like, I don't care about what you're doing. Like this character bores me. So because the titles had character names, you could very easily skip their arcs if they didn't interest you. I will also say with Amazon and with the sort of thumbnail downloading strategy I have, there's this genre of books that's now, I've seen them called low content books, right? And they're people who are just trying to game the system. They're not authors who are actually trying to be helpful, or maybe they are. There's some junk in there. There's some junk in the Amazon library. And so the good thing about just having a sample is if you get to something that really doesn't feel like it's going to be helpful to you, you can just drop it from the sample and you haven't wasted more time than the time you've read the sample, right? You haven't wasted money on it. And so I will say there's some noise in the Amazon catalog.
Yeah, for sure. And they talk about how many millions of books are published each year. And, if you think about Tim Urban's The Long Tail, his blog post, and, how many books do you read a year? How many years do you think you have left? That's a very small number relative to the number that are being published. And so we owe it to ourselves to scrutinize. I think that what is this? Having a wide funnel and a tight filter. So you should check out anything. You never know what's going to be life changing, but also trust yourself. If you get into something and you're like, not for me, just remember that there's way too many books out there, and you should really reserve your precious time for things that you think will have an impact to your life.
Nice. Well, so now I think we've shared how we read. Let's talk a little bit about what we've read recently to share some of the insights. What do you think? Shall we shift gears there, or anything more to say on the why
No,
and how of reading?
I think we did a good job through that. Other than habit, I think I mentioned I read at night. That's my predominant habit, and so half an hour every night, sometimes more, sometimes less. And you'd be really surprised how much that adds up. Because 30 minutes, sorry, a night is 180 some, hours a year, if my math is correct. And so if you think about how long a book, 3 or 4 hours, like, oh my gosh, you've got a habit going there 30 minutes before bed. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I have I can't remember. I think it was Katie Milkman's book on how to change, where she had this metaphor of rigid Rachel and flexible Fernando in terms of how they went to the gym, right? And there's the rigid Rachel, which is like, I will read at this time, and that actually works, right? Like if you have a predictable window, you can do it, and you've tied it to another habit, which is bedtime. For me, I'm more of a flexible Fernando on this, where it's like, I know I want to read today. Whenever the mood strikes, I will go read. I'll read for as long as I want to read. And so it definitely is much more flexible than some of my other habits I have in place. But at least for me, that allows me to make sure I have the desire to read when I'm jumping into it.
100%. And speaking back to the habit, because for 5 years I've read every night, like at my daily streak for 5 years, it's not like I remember reading all the time. And so there are also times when I read in the day because I read something last night that really intrigues me, especially now that I work for myself. I can choose in the middle of the day if I think a half hour invested in a book is going to be great for me. And so just by having it, it's so natural now to just read whenever I read. I bring books to soccer games. I bring books to, if I know I'm going to be waiting somewhere, I will have my Kindle with me. So I have a little bit of flexible Fernando in me as well.
Yes. Well, and I'm forgetting my time privilege and my time affluence that I have. There's this cool concept I just heard about on a podcast called time affluence. But yes, running your own business does give you more opportunity for time privilege. But I believe this is possible even for folks with less flexible schedules.
That's right.
All right, so why don't you share the first book on your list? We'll learn a little bit about it and then we'll run through each book in sequence. What do you think?
Sounds great. So the most recent book that I finished was something called The E-Myth Revisited. It's an older book, I think, possibly the 80s. I don't 100% remember when it was first, but it's on its third edition, it's like third revision. So long enough to have gone through a couple of editing cycles and incorporating new concepts. So it's a good book. One of the major frameworks it introduces is the idea that there are three, I'll call them hats you wear: the tactician, the manager, and the entrepreneur. And so the E-myth, I think, is entrepreneur myth. And this idea that a lot of businesses are started because, and fail, because a tactician identifies a skill and gets frustrated with their boss, or, some inciting event is like, I'm going to do this for myself. And I've seen that pattern play out a lot for myself. I see a hairdresser who loves cutting hair who decides to start their own salon. Or, the person in the book was a baker who decided to start their own bakery. And, I even saw it for myself, to be honest. And, I had a different kind of tactician in me, but, I do business transformation. So I identified that as the tactical thing that I could do, start my own business around it. But then if you're not careful, the tactician can get overwhelmed because you need the other two hats to balance it out. You need the manager, who is more of the systems thinker, to ensure that you're building a repeatable practice around your work. Then there's the entrepreneur who cares about the customer, where the tactician can be a little bit self-centered. This is the thing that I do, and I'm going to do it for you, and that's all there is to it. And then the entrepreneur is a little bit more flexible and like, what does your customer want, and how can you adapt yourself to offer them? And so I thought it was a good thought exercise, even for me, to think about to what extent am I tactician led, am I maybe too manager led, which is a risk for operations folks. That, I have a lot of SOPs for my small solopreneur business, which some people find silly because I'm the same person doing the process, but I see the benefit in myself for not having to remember the process and go through. So am I being too manager led? Am I being entrepreneurial enough where I'm being flexible enough and thinking about the customer offer? So I thought that was a really good framework. Let's see that there's a funny quote in there. Let me see if I can find it here, but it was talking about, if your business depends on you, you don't have a business, you have a job, and it's the worst job in the world because you're working for a lunatic. The implication being you're the lunatic. And it's very common for these tactician-led overwhelmed businesses where you can't stop working, you can't get sick, you can't go anywhere because you're stuck. And I've also seen a lot of businesses trying to sell after doing this for years and then realizing there's nothing to sell. No one wants to buy it because it's just a job. And people aren't wanting to buy a job, they're wanting to buy a business. So I'll stop there, see if you have any thoughts on that book.
Yeah, well, I want to push back on that job conception, but I have another question first. So I like the definition of these entrepreneur hats: manager, tactician. Is the thesis that you should wear all three as an entrepreneur, that you should find the one that you're best at and find a role that fits, that they come in stages? Like, how should one use these three avatars?
I don't think so. I don't think that was it. And again, I'm not the author. I'm just having read it one time. I'll give you my best thoughts, and we'll see. They're not a sequence. I think it's, if you really want to grow a business, and maybe this gets down to maybe your potential pushback on, sometimes people just want a solo career and a solo job. There's not a business there, and that's okay. And so I think being aware of what your goal is, but I do think a central premise here, there is even a quote in there, and it talks about the only reason to go into business is to sell the business eventually. So that tells you something around the mindset of this approach. So I think we could put a solo person to the side. So it's not a sequence, it's a balance, and making sure that each one has their voice, because you could also be entrepreneur led and have no tactician or management. That's not a business either. You can have a manager that's optimizing a poor offer. That's not a business either. And so you just have to recognize that these three are all true. And when are you over indexing on one or another, and how do you keep them in balance?
So I'm going to echo this back to see if I'm getting it. Just because this was a book that was on my list at some point, and if I can
Ooh,
understand
yeah.
it from
Yeah.
you, check.
Yeah.
So if you have this particular goal in mind to build a business that is sellable, these are traps you can fall into that might preclude you from reaching that goal.
I think that's fair. I don't think he would ever, that was never stated explicitly in the book, but I
Yeah.
think that's also a fair interpretation of the summary. Yes.
right? That basically if you are tacticianing too much, or if you're forgetting that you also have to talk to customers as an entrepreneur, right, you
Yes.
may fail to reach that
And
goal.
it's not even saleable, it's like staying profitable. Just there's also a lot of stats around how many businesses fail, depending on what you're looking at. It's like 80% in the first 5 years. That's a lot. And I think the premise of this book is a lot of those are failing because it's a tactician getting into it and never doing the management or the entrepreneurship. And
Hmm.
so you can be unprofitable for a bit, but I really have seen a lot of businesses fail. Like it was a trope that I didn't know was codified in a book until I read this book. And then I immediately scanned through the last several years of my networking and other experience, and like, oh, that was what that was, and I know accounting firms that have a lot of unprofitable clients because that's reflected in the data. They're unprofitable because 80% of businesses fail. So it's all true. And so it's selling is one thing, but it's like also surviving long enough to make sure that you can pay yourself as a business owner in the time that you're on in business. Even if you had no intention of selling, it's a way to ensure a path to profitability and that you can stay doing this thing that you love.
Yeah, well, if that is the goal, the sort of runway game and the stay profitable while you build game is really important. It's funny as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about folks in a very different sphere of business, but maybe because I've lived in these digital nomad zones, I've encountered more of them. These folks who are building creative businesses, but maybe aren't wearing the manager or tactician hat enough, right? They're drawn by something that is calling them, and they understand customers and talk to customers, but the sort of hats of how do we set up systems or how do we just grind on this are more challenging. Again, it can lead to failure. It's just a different type of failure. And often those businesses aren't built to sell, but the balance of the hats is important, even in a very different type of business.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So that's what was occurring. All right, have we hit 5 minutes for this one or anything else to say?
I think it's good.
Your recommendation, would you recommend that people read this? And if so, in what instance?
I do uh, you and I talked earlier about there's I would want to rate the idea and then rate the implementation in book form. I do think there's really, really good ideas in here. And I didn't talk at length, which is kind of the second half of the book, and it's a little more prescriptive on, okay, you have financial goals, like model them, build an operating manual. They're very tactical, very practical, and I agree with all of them. And so I think the combination of those two things, I think, would really awaken people that are, and so in an instance, like when you're trying to start your own business or in the middle of it, or if you're feeling the pain of like, this sucks, I'm not making money, you might get some really strong insights out of here. And as I mentioned, there's this way in which he writes that I found myself skipping over some of it because the parable, et cetera. So I think I would recommend the book. Just, focus on the parts that are bringing value to you. And it's not very long, so that's why I would recommend it.
Have you watched any of Alex Hormozy's content?
I have. I've read some of his books. Not a ton of his videos. I'm aware of it, but yeah,
Oh,
some.
well, and it felt like there was a potential overlap, at least in the audience, probably not in the message. But anyways, all right, nice. So read
Great.
if useful to you, be willing to jump over sections that aren't.
Yes,
Nice. All right, shall I share one?
please.
So last week I read The Secret to Mental Health by George Pransky, and I'm actually going to review it with a couple of other books in the same category because this book, I downloaded it and read it in full. It was so interesting that I wanted to read more about the topic. So I also have three other books on the same topic from other authors to sort of understand this more deeply. So Pransky, his thesis, basically what he's explaining are these ideas that was uncovered by this guy in Canada named Sid Banks, who had some sort of spiritual awakening, divined these principles about humanity, has been using them to live, and has attracted this group of people who use them to live and live in an elevated state of well-being. There's a little element to this that feels a little culty, but I actually think the principles that they unfold and the sort of desire to elevate well-being, to me, those aren't necessarily like, let's drink the Kool-Aid type things, right? They're pretty good things. So I'll share what the principles are, even with a little skepticism around the overall approach. So the three principles that Banks talks about and that Pransky outlines in his book, folks outline in these other books as well. These principles are mind, consciousness, and thought. By better uncovering these principles, we elevate our well-being. And what really struck me was this notion that almost mind is almost like chi, life force. It's sort of like the electricity powering a movie projector, if you will. So his assertion is that mind is sort of all around us. We already have it in us, right? This is the Force, if you're going for Star Wars metaphors. He then has thought, which is the reel on the projector, right? These are the thoughts that are going through. These are the thoughts that are going through our head. They're basically ways for us to engage with the world, and these thoughts come up, and we then bring them to life via consciousness, which is the projector. And the interesting thing about this metaphor is that, at least for me, it's gotten me really curious about my thinking and how thinking drives emotions, drives actions, drives more thinking, right? And so the thing I've been doing since reading this book is when I think something, I tend to say to myself, what if the exact opposite were true? And just allowing me to have a looser relationship with my thinking has become very powerful. Pransky also mentioned he's like, show me a depressed or anxious person, and I'll show you someone who takes all of their thoughts seriously, right? So this notion that we can have more well-being by not having such a strong tie to our thoughts, I think that's really cool. I think the book is a good read. I will say Pransky's book, The Principles, The Message, it's great. The writing is probably not as efficient as another one I found. There's a book called The Three Principles, A Beginner's Guide. They talked much more about what these principles are and how to understand them. Pransky's book is a little bit more about how to apply them as a practitioner. And so it felt like actually reading both of those books in concert was helpful. I read a couple other books called The Inside Out Revolution, What If You Already Knew the Answers to Your Questions, also written by Three Principles folks. Those latter two were a little too unstructured for me, so I didn't even get through the sample. But I would say the Three Principles Beginner's Guide, which had a number of authors, and The Secret to Mental Health, I would recommend for anyone who's just curious about elevating their well-being, right? Anyone who's curious about their own mental health and wants to look at an approach that's a little different. I remember I read George Pransky's book on relationships, romantic relationships, a few years ago, and it was just head exploding because it was so backwards to everything else I've been taught. This has some of the same level of insight where it's just so different from canonical approaches to mental health. And so for anyone who's curious about that and curious about elevating their well-being, I definitely recommend it.
That's awesome. I have a few thoughts I wrote down while we were doing this. One is Tyler Cowen talks a lot, or well, he does this, which is reading widely on a single topic in order to enrich your understanding of it. And I mentioned earlier reading books about how to read a book, and there's one called How to Read a Book. I forget, Mortimer, is it Mortimer or something? It's a great name. But the most advanced form of reading, he calls syntopical. And that is what you're doing. You read a bunch of books on a topic, you arrange in order, you argue with the author, you know, because all books are imperfect representations of a person's thoughts. And so just wanted to highlight something I respect about your approach is reading widely on a single topic and doing that. The other is like, I haven't read as much on this topic. And so I can hear some of your stuff, and I can tell me 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, even would have dismissed somewhat like, oh, I don't understand it, therefore it's whatever word. I would use some dismissive word. It was woo-woo or it's something. But I've also learned that, you know, often what I don't understand doesn't mean it's not true. It just means I don't understand it yet. And I've been trying to cultivate a sense of curiosity for the things I don't understand. And so even though you're describing something and my brain is like, I don't get it, I was thinking about be curious, you know, and kind of approach that. I'm very curious about the things you're reading because they're probably true. They just are coming from someone who's had a life experience I haven't had yet, and they're kind of sharing it back to me, which goes to our earlier when we were talking about reading, about the challenge of reading. And, you know, here's a topic that I think would challenge me in a good way. And then the last one is I have done a lot of meditating in my life, and I've seen the benefit of detachment from thoughts and, you know, kind of ego disillusion where, you know, you think a thought, it's like fully you, and it's your thinking and it's your thought and it's true. And, you know, that can get you into so much trouble and tension and stress. And, you know, the whole act of meditating where you note thoughts and you're, oh, there's one, you know, and you watch how your monkey mind is really kind of wild and, you know, thoughts come and go. And so I that resonated with me as far as like the benefit of detaching from thoughts.
Yeah, well, and it's really interesting because as a coach, there is a lens in which, even without a training in this method, part of my role from my coach training is to have folks examine their thoughts with curiosity, right? Often to say, like, is that thought serving you, right? That building self-awareness, building that observer in yourself. there were parts of that that really aligned with other coach training that I had heard. And so it sort of resonated enough. I agree with you. 10 years ago, I would have called this way too woo. And I say that because I'm a doctorally trained scientist,
Right.
right? And so anything that feels like it's not science, it's more faith-based or just sort of like we're saying that this works, I can view with a lot of skepticism. I think I now, and especially I can do this after this book, who's to say it's not true? Right? Like it might be true, it might not. You're not going to know unless you understand it. And who's to say it's not? Like, are you really asserting that you are so knowledgeable about everything in the world that your heuristics are going to predict everything about what's useful? Like, okay, ego, right? And so the letting the ego go a little bit to say, let me explore this is really helpful. The
Yeah,
other
and
thing I'll say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking about metacognition and how important that is, and this detachment from thoughts to me connects to that, where there's sort of like a reacting layer in humans, and then there's a behavioral layer. Then you have thoughts, but then you have thinking about thinking, and we don't all always go into the thinking about thinking for all our thoughts. And if you can detach from thoughts and see them as what is it, an object to be studied, you can kind of get above them and study the thought. And the only way your thoughts drive your behavior, if you can interrogate your thoughts and have new thoughts, then you can have new behavior. So if you ever find yourself stuck or in a pattern, metacognition and detachment from thoughts can be a really powerful technique to change your behavior.
Yeah, no, and it's relating to another concept I've heard from Andrew Bustamante, this guy who runs Everyday Spy. He talks about it as most people are in perception,
Mhm.
only a few are in perspective,
Mhm.
right? And so if you can get out of perception and get a perspective, then you have, right, more awareness, more intentionality than, he was saying some 80, 90% of people are in perception most of the time. So there is capacity. Isn't that remarkable? I was like, wow, that's really, I don't feel like I'm that way. Maybe I am, but it's nice. The other thing I would say is part of the reason you might have been confused by the message is the messenger, right? Like both of the message itself might be a little bit dubious, but also I'm reading a book from someone who's practiced this their whole life, but I'm like a week old in my understanding of this. So of
Yeah.
course my messaging it is not going to be as clear as someone who has spent years and years and years messaging the same idea, right? These folks actually teach those ideas to others. So what they've taught me is sort of like semi-stuck, and I'm trying to make it stick more through explaining it. But of course, it's not going to be really sticky yet because the idea is still so new. So don't blame that on maybe you're not wanting to or not understanding it, and more could be partly the messenger. All right, next book. What do you got for us, Kevin?
Um, excuse me. It's called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. Little backstory just for you. This was assigned reading the summer before my freshman year in high school, along with several other books. And eighth grade summer Kevin was not as studious as Kevin today. And I did not finish this book. And so, like, shout out to my teacher. Like, I finally have done it. I finished my homework. I read the book. It is very, very good. And what's interesting is I've read other books on World War One. That's what this book is about. As you can tell by the title, it really focuses on just the month of August. So you can imagine this great big war and all the things that could ever be said about it. And then it really focuses just on the month of August. So it's quite a long book. I think 600, 700 pages, something like that on just this month. So it's like really fascinating deep dive into that particular area. Um, I mentioned some of these kind of connections to business concepts. So one of them was, the Germans were big planners, and they took this "you never know what could happen" idea, and their response to it was, "Well, we'll just plan every scenario then," which I think is a fascinating approach. And there are benefits to it, and I think they were very effective early on in the war because they had gone through a lot of scenarios, whereas the other the French side in this case had not. I thought that was kind of interesting around long term. The French focus more on adaptation as opposed to rigid planning. And you can kind of see the benefits and drawbacks to those and how that applies to business as well. There are a lot of businesses that put together a plan and this is the plan and we execute the plan and we're going to go for a year, then we'll reevaluate, as opposed to others who are more adaptive. But if you're too adaptive, you're not going anywhere because you're constantly reevaluating. So just some interesting parallels there that I liked. And then there's this inversion. I don't know the right way to frame it, but there's something else in practice that I thought was interesting is that even though the Germans were huge planners, they left a lot more authority to their generals on the ground, whereas the French had to call back to the central office to know what to do. And I thought it was like a really interesting dichotomy with that first thing about planning versus adaptation, and how it connects to this business idea that I love, which is moving authority to information. And that's a more effective way to run a business than moving information to authority. So the French are constantly like sending notes back to the central office, and the central office is discounting them because they are in love with their plan. And it turns out that's not a great way to wage war, or I suggest run a business. And so again, like there's so much you can learn in business by looking at different aspects of history. Another thing was how feelings can interfere with appropriate action, that we're all human, and the British leader didn't like the French leader, so they didn't coordinate. And that had a huge negative impact on the Allies' ability to, counteract this German offensive. And, just, yeah, people are people, and it happens everywhere. And even though there's a lot at stake in being a rational person, just the feelings got in the way and they just didn't like each other. And so they didn't coordinate, and that was not great. So that also happens in business, is just, sometimes people don't get along. And the last thing is, just what humans are capable of. I do a monthly ruck. I think doing hard things really builds character and helps you understand yourself. And, I've had people tell me that they can't ruck, they can't walk, or I don't go outside when it's above 85 degrees. And I think people are robbing themselves of understanding their capacity to do things. And, just hearing what the soldiers did. So as it relates to rucking, some of the soldiers, they had to march 24 miles a day for 4 days with 65 pounds on, eating nothing but cabbage and carrots. And it's like, I'm not suggesting that anyone do that. It was not great. No one wanted to be doing what they're doing, but it's just amazing what people are capable of. And especially in modern days where we live a pretty stable life. I've got air conditioning here. So even though it's 100 something in Texas today, I'm not really feeling it. And because of that, you can get really unaware, I guess, of what your capacity is. So there's something really interesting about humans' capacity in this book. So I'll stop there. That was some of my key takeaways.
Well, and on that last point, one of my books on the didn't go past the sample is actually called The Comfort Crisis.
I love that book,
How
though.
much we after all, so I
Yeah,
touched on that.
yeah,
Well, and so I heard the parallels to corporate there, right? The leaders who didn't get along, delegating decision making, sort of the instruments of making this apparatus work. Knowing the sort of end result, but not knowing what happened in this August. For that August, did the adaptable or the planning strategy work better for a time? What played out?
yeah. So the German offensive was very effective, and the French were all like pushed back all the way to Paris. And the way the book really ends is when that got pushed back, when the Germans overextended themselves, the French saw an opportunity, and because they had concentrated their forces and kind of moved us against a certain way. So I think it shows, like in the beginning, the very strong planning by the German side was extremely effective, because the French hadn't figured this whole thing out. And there was a lot of warfare had advanced quite a bit, was another element of this, where you still had the French were in a very rigid, like we wear bright red pants so you can see us no matter where we are. We do cavalry charges into machine guns because of, they called it ELAN. I don't speak French, so I'm not it's like kind of yeah, like courage, I guess. And then CRAN, I think that was guts. Like you have to have guts. So they had this idea that that's how you would win, is like the overwhelming belief met the reality of like machine gun fire. And so like they just had to learn a lot, very expensive lessons, like very sad lessons in the beginning. And so yes, the planning won, but I think in the long run, the adaptive learning that the Allies had were part of what helped them win the war.
Well, and it's interesting. I'm hearing elements of the French Revolution there, right? Like, if we believe it's strong enough, we will win. It's like, well, yeah, they've seen that in their history. But what I'm hearing then, what's interesting, and I'll reflect it back to see if I'm getting it, the planning in and of itself can be a good strategy, but was particularly useful because it was new. It was unexpected. And so that's not to say that planning out every situation is good for, say, every business in every situation, but almost trying a strategy that then the opponents, in a case where you really want to win, didn't have an idea of how to respond to the strategy. allowed them to actually take the opponent off guard. And so planning there was that advance.
Yeah, I can see that. And also how in business, like plans are good. I do think they're helpful to go through, but the world is so complex. And I use that term to mean like there's another book called Cracking Complexity that talks about simple, complicated, and complex. And the complex is nonlinear and unpredictable. And, we operate in a complex world. And I think a plan can only get you so far, but you can't perceive every eventuality. And so the plan will eventually not be the method by which you actually achieve success. And so, you can see that in business as well. It's great to have a plan. It gets you started on the initial conditions. Then you have to rely on your ability to adapt to whatever the universe throws at you. And that's a different skill.
It's so funny. When I moved to Mexico, a Mexican American friend said to me, in Mexico, all plans are written in pencil. And that was so helpful for me because this place has a lot more, you need a lot more resilience, you need a lot more flexibility and spontaneity than the very comfortable environment that is often provided in the US. And my first, few years here, that was extremely frustrating, right? Like, I have my plans. I come from the Bay Area and I have my plans, and you need plans. And so I have learned myself to have a lighter relationship with plans because I've been forced by a cultural norm or just the reality of things happening. But yeah, it's so interesting to say, like, okay, firm plans have their value, but if they're too firm, they're not useful. Growing skills in adaptability, resilience, spontaneity are also good to have in your personal toolkit, taking these insights from, civilizations down to our individual lives. What do you think? Is that too overgeneralizing?
No, I don't think so. And I think that's the point of like reading all these things and trying to bring these lessons. And, again, I'm so glad that I was not a participant in World War One, but there's a lot of lessons that you can gain from, and we haven't even talked about the Russian side of the war. And yeah, it's such a fascinating thing. And so, yes, I think those are fair lessons to apply to the individual for sure.
Well, and I'm glad you're reading it because it feels like the world sort of forgets the insights from wars. If it goes too long without having one, right? If you don't have a generational connection to it. So
Yes, but
glad
it's a
someone's
deeper,
reading
well,
things.
it's a deeper topic. I think not to get into it too much because yeah, it can get sensitive, but I think it's 100% true. I think people who haven't been in war have this maybe dreamy interpretation of what it's like, but anyone who has been through it has absolutely nothing. They want nothing to do with it because the privation and the carnage is just so awful, and that applies to a lot of things, not just war. One might say tariffs. One might say other things. It's like we've learned some lessons, but like humanity has learned lessons, but not particularly the people present in the moment, and you have to relearn things. There is a quote somewhere, I don't remember who said it, but it was like some things have to be experienced to be learned. And I think that's just unfortunate. And, but at some level, we can't rewire humans to be different. But yes, I do think that's a benefit of reading and reading history is to, like, man, I want nothing to do with any of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're talking about it, a metaphor is coming to mind that I think of in personal growth, right? When I work with folks on personal growth, and it's the parking structure where you're taking the roundabout to get to the top, right? And that it might look like you're in the same place, but you're actually on a higher level of the structure. And so individuals are often like, oh man, I'm here again. And it's like, yeah, but you're here with all the progress you made on that last loop. Seems like civilizations sort of have to go through the same thing, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
we're here again. Okay, we've learned a
Yes.
little more, but we had
And
to come back to this.
and
Yeah.
especially in military, make me think of Ryan Holiday having conversations with General Stanley McChrystal, I think is the one who quoted it, but talking about, God, it's something really aggressive in the quote about how important it is for people who are leading others to read. Because especially in the military, like the cost of failure is measured in body bags. I think it's something like that effect, where if you do not study what has come before, you are going to make mistakes that you should not be making because you didn't essentially care enough about the people under your charge to go through the work of having read. So they have a very aggressive like statement about what you just said around how important it is to learn from others. And even though the business world isn't usually like failure is not usually measured in body bags, the general principle applies, and you're losing money, you're losing other things. People's ability to flourish is diminished if you aren't learning the lessons that others have put before you.
Nice. A particularly important reminder for leaders and for
Yes.
any of us.
All
All
right.
right. Shall I jump to my next book? I have a couple of options. I'll let you pick. So I started reading Atomic Habits. We can talk about the sample of that one. My other book is The Blood Sugar Solution, totally different genre. or I have a couple of cluster of book bullets. Any of those call your
I
attention?
love Atomic Habits, so let's go
Okay,
ahead and have a
let's go there.
conversation about that. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm reading this off your recommendation, and I'll tell you, my reticence to read this book came from the fact that I feel, and this might be my ego, I feel I'm pretty good at forming new habits. So I was like, I don't need to learn anything about forming habits. I'm pretty good at it already, right? My ego was telling me I didn't need that. But as I've dove into the book, the main insight that I've gotten just from the sample is about systems, practices, processes. Because they're like, I need to hitch a habit to something else that already exists. Like, I already do that. I know how to change my behavior in that way. But I'm seeing that, yes, I understand some elements of this. I don't understand all of the elements, ego. So please continue the book. So from the insights in the sample, I've now downloaded the whole book. And I would give it that rating, right, to anyone. It's both extremely well written and has some great insights and messages. So the three key insights I've taken away from the sample: habits are as much about the practice as the goal. Starting atomic with these 1% improvements can yield these compound dividends. I really liked his visual there and know the miracle of compound interest. And so it was cool to bring that into our own lives outside of the financial sphere. And then it's clear that Clear built a habit of sharing insights with people by writing and doing just that, right? He sort of tells his story at the beginning of how he got to this point, and that just focus on, I'm going to write and share insights with folks from my own habit practice. That habit of sharing the insights, I think, is part of the reason he got there, just continuing to 1% improve. So this one definitely made me run from the book and come up with I did some brainstorming about what systems do I have in place. I've never thought about things in terms of like, okay, what systems do I have in my business? What systems do I have to manage my health? I think of it in terms of habits, practices, activities, but the system lens was a very cool one to give me a new frame to examine, okay, what's the system? And then the question of like, how can we look for a 1% optimization? That, having been a growth marketer at one point in my career, that's no problem. I can find 1% optimizations in anything and do some experiments to test that. But actually fleshing out the systems and doing that reflection myself brought a lot of new insights, and I've gotten that just from the sample. So it's been a pretty good read so far.
So is this one where you will be buying the book, or
I
is
already
this
bought
one
the book. I
you
bought
did?
the
Okay.
book. I just finished the sample yesterday, though, so I don't have any more reading than that.
Okay. Yeah, because I love this. One of the things I wrote down, and I was smiling while you're talking just because it reminded me of all the things that I've learned from this book. But you kind of said something in the beginning, which is you can't learn what you think you already know. And so, if you identify as someone who is like, oh, I'm exceptional at habits, then you would sort of resist a book that talks about habits because you're like, I already know that. When it turns out, there's all the stuff that you don't actually know. So it's just another human thing. You can't learn what you think you already know. Yeah, systems are so important. I love the quote, and I use it all the time now about you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And I've seen that a lot in my work, especially at Atlassian, where we would identify some thing we wanted to do, and you'd sustain performance by these Herculean efforts by individuals, and then a new goal would happen, and then you'd revert back. And I described it as dolphins kind of jumping out of the water. You would kind of go up, and then all of a sudden it would fall back down, and you'd be at baseline again. And the whole point of this is that if you want your business's performance to grow and compound, you need to build systems that are sustaining that performance. So if you're rallying everyone through personal effort, you're not building a sustainable system. I don't know what you're doing. You're having fun. It feels good, maybe an emotional thing, but it's not a system. And so systems are hugely, hugely important. The other thing I thought about is that I find it really powerful to add a framework to something that I've lived the experience of. And so thinking about you being very capable at habits, but then, to me, getting a framework that talks about the habit stacking or tying it to whatever, it's like, oh, that's why it worked. James Clear created an abstraction. He looked at all these different methods and ways of working, and he was like, this is why all that works. And so then that becomes the first principles you can apply to any future thing. And so I just find that really powerful to have a real experience and then read a book that has a framework that then gives you an understanding of why what you experienced is what you experienced. So those are some thoughts I had on what you're sharing.
It's funny, that last point is making me think of this acronym I heard about, and it's from design, but I think it works here. It's called MAYA, Most Advanced Yet Acceptable. So something that feels true enough to your experience that you don't refute it outright, but advances it a little bit. This has that balance of like both I observe what he's saying feels true enough to my experience that I'm not going to discount it, and he's got new insights that are adding to it. So it strikes that balance very well. And again, you can see that's why it's a bestseller, right? People must feel that resonance and that opportunity to learn at the same
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
The funny thing I'll say about that ego bit for me at the beginning, of me saying like, I know how to form habits. I think the interesting reminder, even from his framework, is do I 100% know? Like, yeah, I know 60%, right? Like I'm a 60% habit formation. Does that mean I don't have room to go to a 65 or a 70? Say I'm at 80. Does that mean I don't have room to go to an 81, 82? And so I would say for very few things in life, I think probably a PhD topic, I was at 95 of knowing the thing, right? And then now the field has changed. So I'm not even at a 95 anymore. Like there's 10 more years of insights. But like if you have done a PhD on a topic, then maybe you can claim that you're up close to 100 and you don't need to learn anything more. Really, if a scientist, you should always be learning.
Yeah.
But for anything else, you might have knowledge of it, but do you really have depth? Do you really have mastery? And so reading things on things we know absolutely nothing about is great. Reading things we know something about can also be great. And it's a good reminder that we don't have to discount it just because we're like, well, I already know that, right? Like,
Yeah. I like the quote, as the island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of ignorance. And, the world is so fascinating and deep that no matter what you learn on something, it's not like there's a fixed amount of things you can know. And as you get closer, then you're closer. It's actually like it widens the aperture of like things that you should branch off into, and you actually have more to learn whenever you go deep into a topic. So I think it's
no, and
fascinating.
it's really true. I will say with a PhD, you have sort of your corpus of what you teach, which is the corpus of like, this is what we know really, really well. But almost always when you do study, it yields additional insights that you have to follow up on. It's not like you then say like, okay, well, now we know everything about bonobos. We're done. No, like, right? We just new article on bonobos last week that actually they're more aggressive than we thought, right? Like there's just these things that come out that evolve our thinking. And so this concept that we can even have perfect knowledge or know something about everything. We may know enough to function, and that's a good thing, but almost always we could know more. And that knowing more may increase the shoreline as opposed to decrease it. This myth that like, oh, okay, once I know all the things, the island will be totally painted in and I'll be good. Like, nah, doesn't happen. But our thirst and our capacity and our ability to synthesize grows even when we learn things about
Yes,
things we already know something about.
sure. What do you say? Do you want to do one more book each?
Yeah. Do we have time? Do you have any hard stop at half hour?
Yeah, you can do it.
Okay, let's do one more each. What's
All right.
your last book to share?
The Road to Character by David Brooks. Have you read that one? It's what it sounds like. It's, how do you build character? So the book itself is written in a way, I think it was structured by each chapter as kind of a different person. Maybe we're down for character and exploring a particular element of how you build character that was exemplified by this person. And he uses a framework a little bit. It reminded me of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman around System 1 and System 2. He calls it Atom 1 and Atom 2. And Atom 1 is about beating others. It is this very competitive, very kind of me-centric in the sense that you're trying to prove that you're above other people. And then the second atom is about beating the weaknesses in yourself. And that's a very different fight. He talks about, essentially suffering opens up the floor to there's more space below what you thought was the thing. Like, you go through some awful event, you go through some health challenge, you go through a personal challenge, and you think things are bad, and then it gets worse, and then you're sort of forced to essentially learn about yourself, because even though that's awful, that experience of suffering is awful, it's getting you closer to the truth. And for people who have gone through that, they can look back on that not with, well, with some sort of appreciation in some sense, because it taught them something that they needed to know. And that's becoming the Atom 2. And so one of the things I liked about this is it connects to such a foundational framework for me, which was the forms of mind or adult development theory, and, kind of getting into agency and transformative thinking. And, he doesn't use that language, but he talks about how agency is something, he said, you have to give birth to it. It's not a thing that everyone is born with, but the learning to become an agent in the world comes from that suffering and comes from this thing. It's not this daffodils and peaceful thing. Like you have to earn it, I think is what he's saying. And he's just describing the challenge and difficulty with that. And just having learned separately this adult development theory, and then I'm hearing him talk about it in a different way, but describing what it means to get to agency. And going back to forms of mind, it was something like 60% of the population does not get to, at any one moment, like 60% of the world is not in a kind of self-authoring form of mind, which is where you develop agency. And it's just kind of fascinating to think about, that we might all think we are agents in the world and we have agency and we make decisions, going back to what we said earlier about things that you don't understand, being really curious. Well, what does it mean when this author is describing agency? What does that really mean? And what he's talking about is suffering. And, statistically, because it's more than half of people are not in an agentic mindset, that means on average, like one of every two people is not. And so even though you think you are, maybe you're not. So anyway, I'll stop there. Those are some of my thoughts on that.
And that one's really mind-bending for me because I think having read that adult development, sort of seen the stages, it was like, yeah, okay, I buy that, right? Like for a lot of folks in this socialized mind stage. But putting it this way is really striking, the notion that most people aren't operating as agents. Like I see it, but almost like really internalizing it is very shocking.
Yeah.
Right? That like if they're not operating as agents, how are they operating?
Well, it's good to me, it ties to metacognition a little bit because you have
Mm,
thoughts and you think those thoughts are sourced from yourself,
mm,
but actually they're sourced from your socialization and your upbringing and the people
mm,
you've been with,
mm,
your church, your political affiliation, whatever those are.
mm.
And one of the quotes in the book, it says, "The powers of self-deception are so profound, you are rarely fully honest with yourself." And I think that's true. Like we're so good at ego protection, at like ensuring there's a unified sense of self that anything that challenges that gets rebuffed. And so, you have to really be willing to let that come through. And it feels like suffering because even in the Forms of Mind book I read, they talked about how it feels like being torn in two. If you have values that are conflicting, or if you have two revered others that conflict, you lose your sense of balance. Like you had an anchoring in the world that this is how it works. And then someone challenges that. And that's really difficult. And so, anyway, that I think is related to metacognition, not interrogating your thoughts, and then us being also good at self-deception that, what we think is true is not really true. And unless you're willing to look at it, and often that doesn't happen unless you're suffering because it sucks so hard to go through the suffering that the pain of staying the same is, what is it? It's worse than the pain of change. And like the pain of the suffering has to be so high to get you through that hump where you're now willing to think differently. And so that's why suffering has to be true in order to give birth to the kind of agentic you that sits on the other side.
Yeah, so almost the calculus between suffering work and change work has to tip towards change. And I've seen that. I've seen that as a coach, people who don't change just because the place where they are is not that bad. The place where they want to go doesn't feel that good. So why not stay the same? The
Yeah.
other thing that's coming to mind, though, as you're talking about suffering, there's a couple things that are coming to mind, but did you read Calvin and Hobbes?
Yes.
So the dad always saying, go mow the lawn, it builds character,
Mm.
right? Man,
Yeah.
maybe he was right that Calvin had to go like do the thing that built the suffering to build his character. Darn it, like
Yeah.
he was growing his moral fiber.
Yes, 100%. That kind of connects to the World War One. Like, there's a maturity that came from that. Even sorry, another quote. It says, "The person who successfully struggles against weakness and sin may or may not become rich and famous, but that person will become mature." And using mature in this, kind of like construct towards being a agentic self, and it comes from that. And also says character development happens through daily effort. Maybe connects to Atomic Habits a little bit. You by consistently exposing yourself to challenging situations, challenging people, challenging whatever, and then whatever life is going to throw at you, because life will do that to you as well. Like those are all opportunities to go into the gym of looking at yourself, and why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Why am I thinking the way I'm thinking? And being willing to answer that honestly.
Yeah. It's funny though, it's making me think of having read about post-traumatic growth, right? Do people grow after trauma? And the answer is not always, right? Like people have a choice to grow. And so he's saying, okay, the suffering can be bad enough that you choose to grow. Not everyone does. Some people in the face of that bad event they just double down on where they are, right? And try to put up even more protective mechanisms so that they don't have to change. Even though the worldview has just been cracked open, they're like, no, 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 no. I'm going to deny reality. I'm going to go over here and get cynical and angry and all the things. So there are other paths you can take instead of change. They tend to be less productive on a personal level, but people absolutely take them, right?
Yes. Yep.
So that's not to say go out and give yourself suffering, guaranteed you're going to get a return. You've got to approach it with the mindset of, I'm going to look at this as a growth opportunity. I'm going to look at this as a door and then struggle through it rather than, okay, I'm going to let this struggling have me double down on my
I
own.
know we need to move on to the last book, but the other quote about wherever you go, there you are. And that was something I didn't really understand for a long time. And, I think it's touching on a little bit what you're saying is if you find yourself suffering in a consistent way, but the environment is different, like there is something probably that you could learn about yourself that is contributing to create that environment. And so that idea of like wherever you go, there you are. And, if you have the same behaviors, you're going to see the same patterns and you're going to have the same suffering that you always are trying to run away from.
Yeah. Oh, the internal lens on that is very important. And actually squares with this three principles approach I was talking about earlier. They say that everything of your experience is in your head, right? Like things happen to you, but the way you respond to them. And it's so funny because that's something I've always struggled with is like how much does the external versus the internal contribute to our states? For them, they were just saying it's 100% internal. So interesting to think about the interplay there.
Yes.
All right, last book. So should I talk about the blood sugar one, or should I talk about these clusters of books? Which do you think would be more interesting?
Either one. I don't know that I know a whole lot about blood sugar, so we can talk about that one just so I could learn from you. Or we can talk about the other.
Well, and that one I have some personal experience putting this stuff into practice, so I can share my data that I've collected on, subject number one here. So, Blood Sugar Solution by Dr. Mark Hyman. He's actually written a number of books in this same theme. This one was published, I think, 10 or 20 years ago. I think it's for folks who are diabetic, right, and want to regulate their blood sugar. Some of the key insights from it: what we eat greatly influences our health. This feels intuitive, and yet most of us don't actually attend to it day to day. We sort of eat and graze based on these habits, emotions, all sorts of other things. So this notion of like food should be nourishing is something I've really been internalizing in the past month since reading this book. Also listening to a ton of other stuff and reading stuff on the gut microbiome. That's sort of how I got to this angle. So what we eat influences our health. We can eat foods that maintain a consistent level of blood sugar. And doing so requires a specific diet. He has a diet outlined in the book actually I tried and it was overly restrictive. So on the point I had read this book, I had put myself on a low FODMAP diet for a week, which was working pretty well. This one was more restrictive. So it ended up draining my energy, damaging my sleep, and I put myself into ketosis, which I didn't even mean to do, right? And so it's that this diet did not work for me, but almost through it not working, it's a really useful experiment, right? Of like, okay, I need the gluten-free grains, right? I need some quinoa and things like that, or else I'm not going to feel full. My partner and I both, the week we were on this diet, were just like ravenously hungry. And so it was like we called it after day 5. He says, do this for 10 days. We did it for 5 days and then said, like, this is not having a good impact on our health. Let's stop it and shift back to something where I've now been on the low FODMAP diet for the remaining 2 weeks, and it's just been energizing. I feel nourished by my food. I feel like I have enough to eat. And so it's been an eye opener for me that I think I always ate just based on habits and interest. Oh, that looks cool. I'll eat that. Oh, that's yummy. I'll eat that. We're really taking a lens of, am I putting things in my body that are nourishing my body? The one thing that this book did that was beneficial, it wrecked me for a couple of days, but it kicked an addiction to sugar I didn't even know I had. Because he basically has you go cold turkey. And the day after I started this, I got a crazy migraine headache. And the whole day I just wanted to go dig the sugar things out of the cabinet where I'd hidden them and eat the sugar. And I was observing myself like, whoa. And then reading things that addiction to sugar is stronger than addiction to heroin. Sugar is more addictive than heroin. And so now I've been finding like I can basically take like 5 grams of sugar without producing that response. So I'm low sugar, and then I can eat some things with sugar, made some Gluten-free zucchini bread with a little bit of sugar was fine. If I go above that, I ate this chocolate bar that I didn't realize had 10 grams of sugar. Half an hour later, I was like, I want another one. And I was like, wait a minute. I think there must have been sugar in there. Put up, oh shoot, right? Like I made a mistake. So I really, through this conscious experimentation, have gotten a much better understanding of how food impacts my body. There are a lot of generalizable principles for people, but it's also quite personal. We all have different microbiomes, different hormones, different everything. And so it's a really cool process to both use some generalizable principles and experiment with myself through the food. So I would say this book, I got Kindle Unlimited to get this one. So if you have Kindle Unlimited, well worth it to just go in and check out. Doing the diet, I can't recommend. It might be different if you are actually diabetic. That might work for you, but if you're not diabetic, it wasn't bad input, as you might see, but I was just curious. I was experimenting. I'm a scientist, right? And so can't recommend the diet, but I can recommend the book because it just gives a really useful frame on how to think about this stuff.
That's great. Because the book was blood sugar, I was thinking I don't have a lot of awareness of glucose specifically, but I have a long history with food and health and all those things. So, one, eating affects your health. I didn't know that until I was 37 and I had a big health scare. And I changed my diet pretty drastically and was having all these symptoms. And I was talking to the doctor and I was like, do you think that had anything to do with how I'm feeling? And they're like, no, food has no effect on your health. And I was like, okay. And then like later I'm like, what the hell? Like, it turns out it really, really does because as I changed what I eat, my how I felt changed. And I was like, how silly. But again, I grew up in the 80s. My wife and I talk about this a lot. It was like Country Crock, Aunt Jemima. We used to put white sugar on our cereal that was already having sugar in it. And, Hungry Man dinners, like, it was the worst possible food that I could eat growing up. But we were poor and the people in the very well. Yeah, I just didn't start off with an education about how food affects. So it wasn't until I got to 37 where I started becoming aware. And once you do, like, that's such a fascinating journey to eat things you've always eaten and then notice how you feel and realize that humans shouldn't feel that way. There's a lot of things that humans feel, and the common one is I've always heard like after you eat a bunch of pizza and beer, you feel bloated, and it's like yeah, but you're not supposed to. Like even though that's common, that doesn't mean it's normal. So it's something in what you're eating that is having a negative effect on your body. And when you do that every day, that kind of builds up into I would say a lot of what, at least in America, we're all experiencing with health outcomes relates to the fact that we don't have a really good understanding of what food is and what should go in our bodies. And speaking of like restrictive diets, I've done like autoimmune protocol. That one is crazy. You eat broth for a week essentially, and then, kind of add things one at a time to see if that's going on. So I've done them all, AIP, FODMAP, et cetera. You get so educated on food and learning things like I can have some apple but not a ton of apple. It's like it's weird, that's not true for everyone, but back to my microbiome and genetics, it's like that's true for me. And so you become much more customized in how you eat. And so anyway, I've got a huge history of food and health.
It's so important, and we don't pay attention to it. One other thing I've realized in having this experience here that is a privilege, I live in a place where I have access to food from farms. So I walk down to the market and it's produce that has arrived from an hour's drive to where it's grown, right? I get my produce every week from a place where they actually pick it for us. They pick no more than what we order so that they don't waste, freshly cooked, delivered to me. And so the opportunity to eat whole foods and then to even be selective about which whole foods I'm eating. Yeah, okay, in the US, you can shop at Whole Foods grocery store, not the same thing, right? In the US, having access to this stuff is difficult. It's not what the marketers or various industries want. They want you to be eating this other stuff that is not good for you. Then they want you to be using the medicine to pet. Like it's a bad system, right? But I will acknowledge that I have been spending a heck of a lot more time on food, time, meal planning, and money. Partly because I was like, look, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have yummy stuff. I want to have things that I like because this is going to be hard. And so I've been getting like big bags of nuts, right? And like eating nuts that are like normally quite expensive, but I'm like, screw it. And so it takes time, it takes money, it takes not being in a food desert, right? And so I'm very lucky I have those things, but then it's sort of mind warping about how biased the system in the US is against that. You're often not close to where your food is grown. You don't have cheap access to real food. The Mexican government has something called the canasta básica, which is basically the basic set of food items. The government pegs the price and keeps them consistent, and it cannot be elevated. Has things like tortillas, rice, beans, cilantro, tomatoes, right? The things that you would think of in a typical core Mexican meal. And because of that, these people have a right to healthy food that is cheap that in the US we've totally forgotten. And so it's a weird, both like, it's like cultural, economic, health, but yeah, just in terms of well-being, I had forgotten that you didn't have to feel bloated after every meal, right?
Yeah.
The energy, the like just boost to my well-being from that has been enormous. So if people have the capacity, and there are ways to do it that are not as expensive or as time consuming, it's just so informative to say, hey, what I put in my body influences how I feel. Let me do
Yeah.
some observation and experimentation. It's just
Yeah. Well, even the social elements of food that are somewhat lost as well. I know this is like a whole other dimension of what you're saying, but just thinking about what we have come to take for granted, I guess, in modern world. One is like, where does our food come from? And you kind of have this trust. If it's in the grocery store, then it's edible and I should eat it. And, that's not necessarily true. And, I like, is it Michael Pollan? Michael Paul,
Mhm.
what is it? Eat whole foods, mostly plants, not too much or something is his thing. And don't eat something that your grandma wouldn't recognize as food, or maybe now would be great grandma. But so like a Twinkie, not food, an apple food, onion food. And I think those are just good heuristics to work on. But I was thinking about, one, growing up poor is very difficult, because us growing up poor, it was like macaroni and cheese, hot dogs, processed foods, like those are the things that are cheap enough to live on the poor income. And then also like you're so busy, you're always eating while doing something else. I'm gonna grab a muffin on the way to work, and I'm gonna get some takeout on the way home, and you eat it in your car. And there's all these things that slowing down and cooking meals with your family and eating together with other people. If you travel to Europe, for example, you're going to be experiencing a very long dinner. And that's good for your digestion. It's good for your social connection. And it's another thing of food that's just so different in the US. So we're very fast paced here in the US.
There's also a concept in Mexico called sobremesa, where when you're eating, the server can't come over after eating. You have as long to sit at the table as you'd like after you eat, right? And it's expected that you're sitting there socializing. One thing I will say on the social front, though, is that doing a restrictive diet like this is kind of isolating. We invited some friends over, they brought some stuff, and a friend brought what would have 2 weeks ago been my favorite bag of peanut butter pretzels, right? And it was like, I'm sorry, I can't open that right now, right? We made a whole bunch of other stuff. We made kale chips and like all these things that are like there, but it's like, this is not normal. This is not the way people eat by default, right? If you go to a restaurant, like what the heck are you going to eat? And so it is isolating. So I'm looking to get back to a place where it's like, okay, I can have a couple of rules, but not have to be so far off the reservation. But it's
Yep.
weird because the norm is so unhealthy that if
Yep.
you want to be different from the norm, you have to feel a big gap. And I'm
Yes.
okay with that. I like being unconventional in a number of aspects of my life, but this
Yeah,
one's like, it creates friction, right?
it
So it's
does.
worth acknowledging that being healthy is not the norm, and so may make you feel like a weirdo.
Yeah,
Fun.
and it's with kids, it's also like a very different element of that, where it's like going to a party, and when the kids go out, like they have a gluten allergy, so that's the one thing they can't eat. But you go to a party and it's full of like processed snacks, like it's going to be little gummies, and it's going to be candy, and it's going to be cupcakes from the store, and all sorts of stuff that aren't really good, but just people aren't aware, and haven't gone through that journey. And even just the gluten thing itself, like you become so aware of food and inclusivity, and how you'll show up, and people without any allergies or food awareness will just do what they're normal eating. And then turns out you've got kids that can't eat, and you'll watch them sit there at the end of the table not participating in the social construct of a party. And I feel really bad. And so that awareness on my end has created my awareness in others now. When we have a party, I always ask, like, do you have any food intolerances or allergies? Because the last thing I want is some kid at my house sitting at the end of the table not able to eat because I didn't consider their uniqueness. And so like this food journey just creates a lot of awareness and empathy, and all that stuff I think is really positive.
Yay. Well, who knew reading that book that we would have so much
Yeah.
conversation on it, but it's been, I'm excited to be on that journey. I'm glad you've gone on it. And hopefully, if someone has made it through this far in the video, they find some inspiration and use as well. Anything you want to say before we close the video?
No, it was fun going through some books and our reading styles and approaches and all of that. So yeah, I hope I definitely got something out of the conversation with you, and hopefully our viewers did as well.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful that we both read, that we took the opportunity to share reading insights with each other and have some conversation. This is fun.
It was. Thanks, Tori.
Yeah.